The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Welcome to the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders first webinar in our August webinar series. My name is Etai Mizrav. I'm a senior consultant here at the GTL Center, where I manage the work and educator equity. I'm working with states, I would say exclusively on issues of educator equity, including addressing teacher shortages, diversifying the educator workforce, as well as the topic we're going to talk about today, which is identifying and addressing gaps in the access to effective educators. We're also lucky to have with us Team Regal today, team from the Texas Education Agency, who is one of the really exceptional state leaders on this topic of equitable access. I will introduce Tim and his work later on. A little bit about the norms for this webinar. First of all, please mute your line to improve our audio quality. Use the chat box to ask any questions that you want. We have Whitney here on the back end monitoring the chat. Whitney, if I missed any question, please let me know. And then throughout the presentation, you can also use the raise your hand option to unmute your line. We're happy to take questions, hear your examples, have you participate. Hopefully this could be a collaborative webinar as we're going to talk about state experience and you are the practitioners on the field. Before we dive into the topic of the webinar, Whitney, if you can skip a slide. Sorry, Whitney, one more. There you go. So before we dive into the topic of the webinar, we want to share a little bit about the GTL Center's work. And the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, well, we've supported dozens of states and districts, helping them to select, customize, implement a range of strategies for different contexts, both urban, rural. I'm not gonna go over the list now, but I'm gonna give you a minute to look at the map. It's actually that even is not exhaustive. I can think of one or two additional projects that we did in other places. So really a lot of work around strategies for equitable access all across the country. Let's get to the next slide. Now in this series, we're partnering with our colleagues from Texas, Hawaii, and Wisconsin to share with you some of the most important school improvement levers, improving equitable access to great teachers for the students who need it the most. And our partners in this series are going to share some of the strategies that they've implemented in this work. You will have an opportunity to explore our new and free tools, resources, and supports for the strategies that fit your own context. Perhaps this is a good time also to note that this webinar series is the final one in the federally funded version of the GTL Center that sunsets soon, but the center or the resources and the supports will continue to operate under AIR, and all of our resources are going to remain free on the GTL website. So we're going to have some contact information at the end, and feel free to reach out if you have questions about support that may be available to you during this transition and after. Let's skip to the next one. So a little bit to ground our work on equitable access. As you know, it's part of federal policy as well. And it's all started in 2014. We started working on this issue when the U.S. Department of Education asked all states to establish plans to ensure that all students, and in particular disadvantaged students, have access to experienced, qualified, and in-field teachers. And then that same requirement became federal law after the signing of the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. ESSA reaffirms and strengthens the commitments for improving and providing a clear requirement to identify gaps in the access to ineffective, inexperienced, and out-of-field teachers this time. But the law also allows states to make their own definitions on many of these key terms. For example, states will decide what is low-income minority, what it means, what is ineffective teachers or out-of-field or inexperienced, and even what is an equity gap. And for some states, the work on developing a policy and making those decisions was part of their development of the initial ESSA plan they worked on last year or the year before that. But other states are now revisiting or refining or improving their equity policies under ESSA. Texas is one of them, as we're going to hear from. And the presentation today is about supporting that particular process. We can skip one. So when we're talking about those definitions, what we're really doing is trying to answer a few questions, and it's very important questions that we need to answer in our plans. The first is, who are the teachers? Who are those ineffective teachers that we wanna look at and see who is taught by them? The second is, who are the students? Who are the low-income and minority students? Sometimes it will be low-income and minority schools that states are looking at, or maybe other groups of students that we wanna make sure they have the access to the good teachers that they need. What is a gap? Is any difference in the access to good teachers a gap, or are we setting a different definition for what is a gap? And then how would states support districts? Perhaps the most important question: how would they actually close gaps? Now, different policy decisions on that may alter the number or types of schools that end up being identified, and they can also result in some important and maybe undesired, unintended consequences. For example, you may end up classifying too many or too schools or districts for lacking access to teachers, maybe over-identifying gaps in districts while ignoring gaps in others. You may be missing important gaps at the student, school, or district levels. But I really believe that a rigorous and thoughtful decision-making process that includes analysis of data and reviewing research and best practices, and perhaps most importantly, considering your own context, that could help avoid some of these unintended consequences and produce a process that really identify those real, pretty devastating gaps for the most vulnerable students, and most importantly, develops a process of identifying and implementing strategies to close those gaps. We can skip to the next one. So in the GTL Center, we've recently issued a new brief that follows that process and provides some recommendations of how to make these decisions, and provide some examples from the states that have implemented that process early. And that brief is available to you. I think Whitney is gonna paste it now on the chat, so you can access it, and feel free to download it and read it after this webinar concludes. And in this brief, Whitney, if you can skip to the next slide, please. In this brief, we're following 4 steps in this decision-making process, 4 decision points. The first decision point is identifying those ineffective, inexperienced, and out-of-field teachers. The second is identifying the students, designing the comparison groups. Which groups of students are we going to compare their access to teachers for? The third is deciding what is an equity gap. And the fourth is deciding what to require and how to support districts with schools that are identified. And what I'm going to do is, before I'm going to let Tim present, I'm going to briefly review those 4 steps and some of the considerations that they include. Let's skip to the next one. So the first decision point on defining ineffective, inexperienced, and out-of-field teachers. And perhaps and I'm hearing some background noise. If everyone can please mute their lines. Thank you. That's better. And if you have a question, please use the raise your hand button. So defining ineffective teachers, the first question I would ask when thinking about how to define ineffective teachers is the state teacher evaluation system one that we can use, one that with results that can be reported at the school levels? And the reason is that state developed and revised those educator evaluation systems extensively in the past decades. and many states continue to improve the evaluation measures and align them to their professional learning standards. They connect it to the professional growth of their teachers. So, in my opinion, using these systems may be the best chance of identifying actual disparities in the access to effective teachers. But it may be the case for some states and districts that using them is perhaps not the best course of action. Specifically, I would ask if there are unintended consequences that are, or maybe specifically, are we in jeopardy of punishing districts who implement evaluation systems with more rigor? When you have states that have evaluation models that vary across districts, it's important to ensure that we are not flagging gaps only in those districts with better evaluation system or those that implement the state system more rigorously, while ignoring gaps in districts that may identify nearly all of their teachers as effective. In fact, I would guess that greater gaps exist in places where the gaps are not measured because they don't implement a rigorous evaluation system and perhaps not continuously improve educator practice. So that's something to be cautious about. I think defining inexperienced and out-of-field teachers is more straightforward. We can give some examples. First of all, as far as ineffective teachers, if you want to skip to the next slide, Whitney. As far as ineffective teachers, most states define it using their evaluation system, and you have some examples here on the screen. Inexperienced teachers, most to all states would define it as teachers in their first year or teachers in their first or second year. And out-of-field teachers would for the most part be teachers who lack the proper credentials, licensure, or degree. Washington, D.C. has an interesting definition in their policy document, and that teachers who do not have a major certification or an effective teacher evaluation designation in the subject. So what D.C. did is kind of exclude those effective teachers from the bad definition of out-of-field, just focusing on those out-of-field teachers who are ineffective in the classroom. And I thought that's an interesting example to note. So now what I'd like to do, Whitney, if you want to skip to the next slide, is ask you all a question about defining ineffective teachers. And what I'm interested to know is whether you believe that your state or district educator evaluation system is the best mechanism available for measuring or identifying ineffective teachers. So again, do you believe that your state or district educator evaluation mechanism is the best available measure for identifying ineffective teachers? And if you're in a state with different systems for different districts, think about it cumulatively of all of them and think if that's the most reliable or the best measure we could use. So let's start the poll for maybe 20 seconds and let you all answer and see what you all think. Give it a few more seconds, and then you can close the poll, Whitney. All right. Are we able to see the results? All right. So a majority of you, and that's interesting, 55% of you said no, that it's not the best available measure, while 45% said that it is the best available measure. So I think what that shows us is that there's still a really long way to go in terms of how to think about educator effectiveness in a way that people can trust and in a way that is valid enough for us to actually measure. Although 45% of you think that they're close to being there. I wonder if anyone that said no, that said that it's not the best available measure, would like to share what would be perhaps a better measure of evaluating or deciding who are those ineffective teachers are. I know that people are often reluctant to be the first one to participate in a webinar like this, but I do encourage you, if you have any idea of how you would propose to measure it or how you measure it already, we would love to hear. So let me pause for a few seconds, and if you do, please raise your hand so we can unmute you, or use the chat. Let me give you another second or two to think, see if anyone has something that they want to share.
Hey, Etai, this is Jenny. We've got some questions coming into the box. Do you want me to read them to you?
Please.
All right. So from Jessica Bennington, we have student outcomes need to be looked at as well. Sometimes the teacher seems great, but students don't progress in their class. And from Jay Blaine, have any methodology that doesn't rely on standardized test scores. Let's see, we've got one from Lynn Pachel. We have a question about Kansas. We've got a typo on our slide. Sorry about that, Lynn. Thanks for mentioning that. Those are our responses that I see so far.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, yeah, so as we all know, using standardized test scores is a controversial measure, and there's a lot of opinions about how to do it and how to measure educator practice, and that's what makes this process of defining ineffective teachers so difficult. That you know, without the buy-in and without the trust of educators in this definition, it's really hard to close gaps, because we're going to have to close gaps together with the teachers that are going to have to be the agents of change. It has to be a measure that they trust. So that's definitely a challenge. And thank you for sharing, everyone. All right, let's skip to the next decision point. Decision point number two. Oh, actually, before that, I wanted to make a suggestion or throw an idea, and that's around using educator diversity as another measure, perhaps a fourth measure of ineffective, inexperienced, out of field, maybe diverse, or as a measure of using of defining ineffective teachers. We know that diversity is correlated with effectiveness. Now, there's overwhelming research that indicates that diverse educators have create benefits for students. They hold higher expectations from minority and all students. They serve as role model. They make more equitable assignments to gifted and talented programs. They make more equitable assignments to disciplinary actions. They improve academic outcomes for students. They do what effective educators do. And you can kind of think about it like experienced teachers. It's not the case that every experienced teacher is an effective one. And it's not the case that every educator of color is an effective one, but a more experienced workforce is a more effective workforce, and a more diverse workforce is a more effective workforce. And so should we also measure the access of students to a diverse workforce, or the access of students of color to teachers who share their race and their background? So I think it's an idea worth considering. We hypothesize, and there is research to back it, that a diverse workforce would be a more culturally responsive, culturally competent one, which would lead to greater access to teachers. So that's an idea for states to consider. And with that, let's jump to the second decision point. You can skip the next slide, Whitney. And that is, who are the students that we're comparing for access? There are three ways in which states can measure gaps and compare students. State can compare gaps across the entire state, that bottom level in our pyramid, and that may end up, if you're comparing schools across the entire state, you may end up identifying more schools in a particular district, maybe a district that struggles more than others. Alternatively, states can identify schools within each district. So you'll identify the same number of schools, those that struggle the most, those that don't have access within each of their districts. That may be proper in large states where the districts are very different from one another. And then finally, states may identify gaps within schools. So students within the school, which teachers are they assigned for, and is there a difference between low-income, minority, or other students to other students in the assignment to effective, experienced, and in-field teachers. To do that, though, states would need a data system that allows for student-teacher match, which is something that a lot of states don't have. But Ohio and Tennessee are two states that do have that, and they do measure equitable access all the way down to the student level. And again, I wanna ask you another question and open another poll here. And the question, you can skip the next slide here, and but don't open the poll yet. Do you believe that equity gaps in your states occur for the most part between districts, meaning that perhaps you would want to measure it as the state at large, that you have some districts that really struggle while others that are more have more advantage? Is it within schools? Is it within districts between schools? So do you have districts within those districts significant achievement gaps, and you should measure gaps within those districts between the different schools? Or is it within schools, which is more common when we have more integrated systems? We see more gaps happening at the school level. Or is it a combination of those three in your states? Let's get a sense of where most of you see, or where you hypothesize that your gaps are. So let's open the poll, Whitney, and let's give you a few seconds to decide. All right, so I'm already seeing. Let's give you 5 more seconds. Okay. So I think a vast majority of you have said that this is a combination of the three, which is very common. And if that's the case, we need to be conscious of those different types of gaps and make sure we're finding those students who don't have access to good teachers and for those different reasons. And those would require different measurement and different methodologies. So it's something to keep in mind. Let's move on, since we want to get to Tim's presentation. Another question that I think we should ask is whether there are additional student groups that we should look for, whether they have access to good teachers. Particularly, I'm thinking about students with disabilities and English learners, groups that are often disadvantaged, are often at the low side of the achievement gap, and would benefit the most from improvement in the access to good teachers. So should we take the opportunity of this requirement and measure access for them as well? And I know that some states are doing that, Massachusetts, for example. Let's skip to the next one. So moving on to the third decision point is and how are we defining equity gap? What is a gap? And there are a few considerations that I would recommend. One is looking at the overall size of gaps in the analysis. If you have very large gaps, you may want to put a certain threshold for what's an actual gap. And if you have very small gaps, maybe you don't. Think about your local context and mostly think about your broader state goals and how those definition of gaps speak or align with potentially your strategic plan or with other priorities you have in your ESSA plan. I want to give some examples. If you can skip to the next slide here. So Ohio and New Jersey are two examples of states that identify gaps as any difference Whitney, if you can skip please to the next slide. Thank you. Any difference in the access to effective experience in field teachers for minority, low income versus other groups? So any kind of difference between those groups would be a gap. In fact, New Jersey shared in its ESSA plan disproportionate rates in the access gaps that are all under 10%. And they offer a really aggressive strategy implementation plan and set the goal of eliminating any disproportionate access to out-of-field teachers by 2020, to inexperienced teachers by 2022, and to ineffective teachers by 2027. And I thought this is a really a good practice in terms of goal setting. I think it's ambitious and it's worth noting. Other states, giving here Missouri and Washington, D.C., do set threshold for what counts as a gap. Both of them set 10 percentage points. And the advantage of doing that is if their gaps are severe, and I believe that for both of these states in the ESSA plan, the gaps that were reported are indeed severe, setting that threshold would allow them to really focus on those places that struggle the most. And I think Tim may speak to that issue as well later on, about focusing on the right schools and focusing on those that struggle the most. So if the gaps are larger, they may want to set a threshold. And then finally, if you want to skip to the next one, the last decision point is perhaps the most important one, and one we're going to hear from Tim about, is how are we going to support districts who are identified. And here we see a range of strategies from early implementers. Some of them are on the screen here, and we'll send you the slides. You can use those links and check out some of what those states are doing. But at this point, I'd like to hand it off to Tim. If you want to skip to the next slide, Whitney. And I want to introduce Tim. First of all, do we have, we had some technical difficulties. Do we have Tim on the line?
Yep, Tim is here.
Tim is here.
Tim, I'm really happy to have you here. Tim is the Associate Commissioner now at the Texas Education Agency. And I've known Tim for several years through this equity work while he was leading it for Texas and I at the time for Washington, D.C. And I think from the beginning, Tim was one of the leaders who really took the issue seriously and addressed it with real determination and professionalism and drove for results, which you're gonna hear about today. In fact, Texas is so ahead of the curve that they're already in the stage of reviewing what they did and modifying based on some of their lessons learned, which Tim will talk about today. So Tim, thanks so much for being us and sharing, and let me hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Etai, and thank you for generously describing our revision process as being ahead of the curve. I don't know if that's exactly the way I describe it, but thank you all. I'm going to spend a minute here talking a little bit about what our past approach was to the equity process, and then talk a little bit about the revisions we're bringing to bear on our process and the reason for our revisions. Just as a logistical piece here, do I just signal to you all when I want you to advance to the next slide, or do you want me to share my screen for my slides?
You can just tell us when you'd like it to go forward.
All right, so please go ahead and go forward on this one. You can go ahead one more time. So just from context, and I know anyone who listens to Texas talk about anything gets really nauseated by us talking about the size of Texas, but in this particular instance, it actually does matter quite a lot in signaling what was ineffective about our old approach to equity. We have about a little over 1,200 districts in the state, including our charter schools. And then our state is also divided into 20 geographical areas that have a regional service center in each of those 20 areas. That's kind of our apparatus to support the 1,200 districts across the state. So that's going to provide a little context here in just a second. You can go to the next slide. So our approach right now has been that if a district receives Title I funds, they're doing an equity plan. You know, basically it's in that section of Title I. And so on an annual basis, we have about 1,136 districts creating equity plans. You can go to the next slide. as you can imagine, that's quite a lot of equity plans. And we have a lot of diversity as far as district size, and I know everybody does in our state. A lot of our districts, I would say about half of our districts, if not a little bit more than half, so right around 700 districts are small districts. They have 3 campuses or less, so they'll have the elementary, middle school, and high school, or some of them are K-8, 12. And so we sort of split out the process so that we had one approach to analyzing equity gaps for our smaller districts and one approach for our larger districts. The approaches weren't too wildly different. It was just the comparison groups were a little bit different. So if you were a larger district, we asked you to quartile up your campuses into your, from high to low poverty, from high student of color percentage to low student of color percentage. And then basically do a comparison within the district on ineffective, out of field, and inexperienced teachers. And so did you see a higher percentage of ineffective, inexperienced, or out of field teachers on your high poverty campuses or your high student minority or students of color campuses? And if you did, then you had a gap, you got flagged. Let's move forward with the planning process. For our smaller districts, because you didn't have enough campuses to really quartile, we asked you to compare any campus that received Title I funds to a state average. And if you were on the wrong side of the state average as far as inexperienced or out of field teachers, then you got flagged for an equity gap. And you can go to the next slide. So not surprisingly, I'm guessing we've all wrestled with this. We've had some issues with this, right? Even where we did have clear definitions, Etai referenced this earlier in the presentation. We do have very straightforward definitions of what it means to be an out-of-field teacher and what it means to be an inexperienced teacher. Inexperienced is a teacher within their first 2 years. Out-of-field is a teacher who doesn't meet the certification requirements for the grade and subject they're assigned to. Despite that being the case, we saw just a lot of struggles on the part of districts in accurately identifying the percentage of their teachers that were out of field, the percentage of their teachers that were inexperienced. Inexperienced was a little easier. Out of field was a little tougher, especially as this transitioned over from highly qualified, because we have state certification rules in Texas, and a lot of folks just sort of got used to, if you're highly qualified, you're fine. And highly qualified and state certification rules had strong overlap, but not 100%. And so there's a lot of underreporting of out-of-field teachers. Ineffective teaching, we let districts define on their own. As Etai mentioned, the vast majority of our districts gravitated towards just base teacher appraisal ratings as their definition of effective or ineffective teaching. Some of them threw some other things in there, but just as a contextual piece, we don't collect, and we're not allowed to collect at the state level teacher appraisal information from our districts. So we're not allowed to actually know what individual teachers' appraisal ratings are. So that always makes it a little hard for us to do much with that variable. And even when we ask our districts to sort of rest on that variable, the quality of the variable we believe to be in question, but we don't actually have a way of verifying that, because again, we don't have that data ourselves to analyze. Despite all of that, we saw a lot of districts just not indicating that they had equity gaps. Generally speaking, when that happened, we tried to push them to look into student progress measures. One of our domains in our accountability system is a student progress measure. We tried to get them to push into that and see if there were gaps there. Most of them didn't take our advice and just basically closed out their equity planning process with sort of like no gaps flagged. You can move on. Another issue is, as you can imagine, with 1,136 equity plans coming in on an annual basis, even when we deployed our 20 regional service centers as best as we could, that's still 50 to 60, sometimes in our larger service centers, 80 to 90 equity plans that are getting annually. That's just those are too many plans to meaningfully review, and even worse, to have any chance of supporting districts as they pursue strategies to close their equity gaps. It became very clear to districts early on that there wasn't much that was being done with these equity plans, and so despite all of our talking points that that aspirationally laid this out as something more than it could be. It was basically being reviewed as a compliance exercise. You can go to the next slide. Can you go back one? There we go. So we have a new recommended process that we are in the final stages of shaping and presenting out to our districts and our regional service centers. We decided that ineffective teaching or teachers wasn't being well defined, and at the end of the day, we felt comfortable with the concept that, from a student lens, if I'm growing, I'm sitting in front of a teacher who's effective for me, and if I'm not growing, I'm sitting in front of a teacher who's not effective for me. And we know at the individual student level, there's a lot of noise with that, but as you start aggregating that up into meaningful end sizes, there's something there. I remember when this rolled out, Etai and I talked a lot about this 3 or 4 years ago. We didn't necessarily love the term an effective teacher, because we know that teachers can be effective for some students and wholly ineffective for other students. And so we've kind of always talked about it as an effective teaching. And along that line, whether or not students were growing in response to the teaching they were receiving or the teacher that they were sitting in front of, we felt was probably the best proxy for whether or not a true equity gap existed. So we are gravitating towards using student growth as a proxy for effective teachers, using a student growth measure as the indication for who should be doing equity plans and who shouldn't be doing equity plans, and then shifting the concept of inexperienced and out-of-field teachers down to the level of explanation for why students weren't growing, but not necessarily the variable we're hanging our hat on in determining who does equity gaps. So great. Students aren't growing, within this district. Certain students, low-income students aren't growing in this district. An explanation for that could be that disproportionately those students are sitting in front of inexperienced teachers. But we didn't feel like inexperienced or out of field had quite the level of proxy value that student growth did when it came to equity issues. Next slide. So what we're doing, like I mentioned, we shifted back out to a sort of a district lens. So we were asking districts to quartile and compare campuses within their district by switching to a student progress measure as the flag for whether or not you have gaps amongst student groups. We're back out to a district level examination. They are based on state assessment results, and we know that there's mixed feelings about relying on state assessment results. We feel like we're hoping that that's tempered to a certain extent by not looking at proficiency, but instead looking at student growth. Again, a part of our data collection and accountability system is this concept of a percentage of students who meet or exceed growth targets, and we are looking at that for all tests taken. And the comparison groups, we're comparing white students to Hispanic students, white students to African American students. Those are our two largest students of color groups, and then economically disadvantaged to non-economically disadvantaged students. Next slide. And so when we ran this data, obviously, we gamed this out to see what it would actually mean for us. Again, with going back to the purposes of if we're going to run an equity plan process, we don't want it to be viewed as compliance. We do recognize that there are plenty of districts who, in their context, running through an equity plan process has less value than other districts. I.e., we have 32 students; they're all on a single campus. We don't even have sort of the end size for any of this to matter, that type of stuff, or we're completely homogenous. So when we reran this to get this to a place where we can meaningfully differentiate between the greatest need to do an equity plan and thus a fighting chance for us to meaningfully support those districts, these are how the numbers shook out. And so districts with less than a 10% gap between those comparison groups, any of those comparison groups, we had 853 where that's the case, we would suggest wouldn't have to do an equity plan. Districts where they have gaps between 10 and 20% between those comparison groups, and that's about 237 districts, they would do an annual equity plan. And then any district that had a greater than 20% student growth gap between this comparison groups. This is in the future. We don't have our district diagnostic process fully baked out, but we are building out a process by which we have a third, sort of a third party, highly trained against a district diagnostic rubric, basically, would go in and support a wider diagnostic process with the district to try to determine systematically what in the district systems or processes are kind of breaking down so that these gaps are present and persistent. You know, something around HR, staffing, master scheduling, the ability of instructional leadership to effectively grow teachers rapidly, that type of stuff would all be baked into our district diagnostic process. So that's how we would sort of split the world, right? So that, again, adding together the annual equity plan and the district diagnostic and equity plan, we're looking at about 300 districts, which again gives us at TEA and our regional service centers a much stronger chance of meaningfully both reviewing those plans, but also supporting the strategies identified by those districts as those most likely to help close equity gaps. Next slide. We obviously we still have some concerns with that, and there's some nuances still being unpacked with that. We did shift to, we didn't want any single year. We didn't want there to be a massive popcorn effect. We see this kind of in our school improvement process, where one year will flag you, and then you'll have a good year and you'll come off, and then you'll have another bad year and you'll pop back down, and then you'll have a good year and pop back out. So to avoid that, we're looking at 3 years. We're looking at a rolling 3 years, and if 2 of the 3 years you get popped in a particular band, then you're doing an equity plan. So it shifts the burden of any particular year being overly the reason for being in or out of an equity planning process. We're shifting the timeline. We've been doing our equity planning process in the fall, so our accountability or most of our data, our state assessment data, all that stuff gets wrapped up and pushed back out to districts in early summer. I'm guessing like most of you all. That closes out the year, gives them all the data they need to do an equity planning process. What we found, however, is that really mapping out a strong planning process with identified strategies in November, December has such misalignment to when districts and campuses normally step back and do thoughtful and deliberate planning and map out a strong implementation plan and timeline for whatever it is they're pursuing to help improve. We know that happens generally. That allows for one, preparing for change in the late spring, to starting summer training, if it's instructional leadership training, whatever it might be that requires some intensive training, letting that happen in the summer so that when the school year starts again, you have those systems stood up and ready to roll out. We know that for most of our districts, it starts in the spring, and so we want that equity planning process to be an early spring process, so that when you stand up and say, okay, great, one of the things that we need to do is improve our coaching of principals and campus leaders through our principal managers, we can actually start planning for that expectation in the spring in a way that aligns with normal implementation planning timelines. We are also, if you're doing an equity plan, we're providing priority points to those districts that wind up doing equity plans, so that they do kind of move to the front of the line for any sort of competitive grant program, or it's sort of like participation in initiatives that we run. So we have a Grow Your Own grant program that help create pipelines of teachers from within the community. We have a principal residency grant program. I'm guessing many of you all do some Title II hold aside for principal residency programs and grant programs. We do that as well. And so if you are flagged as a district that is doing an equity plan under this new approach, then again, to reinforce this idea that we're here to support you, not to punish you a second time under a shadow accountability system, you're going to get opportunities to move to the front of the line for a lot of these grant opportunities that we hope align with some of the strategies you're pursuing to close your equity gaps. And then the last one is, it's one thing to be a district doing an equity plan when every single district is doing an equity plan. It's a lot easier to explain, not because it's It's just a mechanical requirement of all districts. When you're one of the 300 who's doing it, because there's data to back up the fact that you have to do it, we want there to be the urgency of that data. We're not suggesting that we want to hide from that reality, but we also want to be sensitive to this idea that we already have an accountability system. It already provides a lot of pressure to our districts. And we want to be sensitive to the idea that we don't want the equity approach and the process to be viewed as a second accountability system, which again leads to a lot of short-term thinking, a lot of desire to fix the glitch and get off the list as quickly as possible, as opposed to really sitting back and thinking of long-term solutions that are going to be sticky and sustainable. Next slide. So our timeline, like I said, we're in the process of rolling this out. This fall, we'll ask districts to make any updates to their current equity plans based off of new data, keep those updates local, and then come October, November is when we'll start sending out those individual letters to the districts that have either gaps that are 10 to 20% in size or 20% or greater. And then we'll, like I said, we will work with them over the course of the early spring to do an effective planning process and hopefully create really strong strategies that, one, fit normal implementation timelines and calendars, and two, align with opportunities to apply for certain grants, initiatives, or pilot programs run either through TEA or through the ESCs that align to the strategies you're pursuing. So I'll pause there. I think one other thing I want to flag that didn't show up on a slide necessarily is that the strategies districts select for pursuit in trying to close their equity plans, by default they align. So we built it's not an original title, we have an effective schools framework basically in the state of Texas that try to highlight the 13 most effective campus actions campuses take to ensure student growth for all students. Modeled after, if you know New Leaders Transformational Leadership Framework, DC Public Schools has their own effective schools framework, so it's modeled after those things. But we use that in our school improvement process as a way to sort of narrow the look as on part of campuses as far as what they're going to pursue for sustainable growth and improvement. Those are going to be sort of the default strategies we're going to ask our districts that go through the equity planning process to think about first and try to pursue. The things you wouldn't, no one would balk at. There are things like strong instructional leadership, data-driven instruction, lesson planning, formative assessments, short cycle observation feedback, things that grow teachers, but also HR strategies that ensure that effective teachers are on your highest needs campuses and serving your highest needs students. So things like that. I just wanted to flag that one. Otherwise, I'm done. Etai, I'll stick around in case anyone has any questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. This was so interesting, again, to hear about your lessons learned from a policy that was already implemented for some time. You are ahead of the curve in that sense, and I think we have some time for questions. If there are questions for Tim, maybe before that, let me highlight a question or two that I saw in the chat, or a comment here from Kevin from Illinois, saying in Illinois we have found that a school or district is supposed to rate themselves on equity, they tend to grade themselves positive. We have started to push a little harder with the school we work with to reflect more deeply about equity. Thank you, Kevin. Yes, I think that's one of the unintended consequences we warned against earlier, that let's not punish those districts who take it seriously and work with you and think of ways to create a deeper process in all districts. And then I saw a question here about a comment earlier, for EL students and students with disability, what gaps would be measuring? Would we measure whether students taught by teachers who are ineffective and inexperienced in our field? Yes. So the same, the intention was to measure the same levels of access to those same teachers, ineffective, inexperienced in our field, but for those groups, students with disabilities and English learners and maybe others. In DC, for example, they measure in a particular geographical area that is an area of poverty. equally. So yes, so think about some other student groups. Let's see if anyone has other questions for Tim. Oh, I think I see another question in the chat from Carol for Tim. I'm interested in hearing about data system. Does the state support a robust data system that districts use to identify gaps at a meaningful level? Or is it a district to district? Tim, that one's for you.
Yeah, as far as we don't have any particular tool that we push out to districts or that we provide to districts that is, I would say, specifically equity focused. We have a base sort of tool that they use in the equity planning process. We have a website, texasequitytoolkit.org, I believe. I should know that. That does walk them through step by step the process to create sort of collect the data, analyze the data, interpret the data, ID strategies. And so we have base tools in there that they use that help them sort of populate the data and do the analysis. It's helpful from the out of field and inexperienced lens, because those are just clean data that have a clean definition. But when it comes to the more nebulous concept of ineffective teaching, we don't have anything we push out to them. And based off our revisions, we still won't, because we're kind of going all in on this concept of if students aren't growing, they're not experiencing effective teaching. And that's just baked into the basic data they receive through the accountability system.
Great, thank you, Tim. Other questions, either by raising your hand so we can unmute you, or by sharing them in the chat box. I'm trying to see if there's any question I missed here. Let me give you another minute to ask. All right, I see another question. What role does higher education have in this work? Tim, do you wanna start?
Yeah, so higher education. I'm interpreting that to mean I'm guessing you're meaning teacher preparation. Just as a context in Texas, the vast majority of our teachers are prepped outside of higher education. We have a strong alternative certification apparatus here in Texas. So I think about 55% to 60% of our teachers come through our alternative certification programs. I think I'm glad you asked this question, because one of our immediate flags for us as a state was that our preparation and certification apparatus was not nearly as rigorous as it needed to be. Clearly we were seeing too many links between inexperienced and ineffective teaching. My guess is that's true everywhere, right? So we have, in conjunction with higher ed and our alternative certification programs, we are in the process of actually switching a lot of the content of our teacher preparation is being changed to sort of outcomes-based, demonstration-based, and our certification exam we're moving over to EdTPA. I'm not sure right now. It's not 100% certain that we're moving over to it, but we're piloting EdTPA, which I think a lot of folks might be familiar with. It's more of a portfolio-based assessment for teacher candidates. And so the hope being that we're all in the same trap, right? The districts that need effective teachers the most are often the ones with the highest volume of inexperienced teachers, and so we are trying to beef up the rigor of our certification exam so that those teachers are a little bit more ready on day one. And if that flags massive shortage issues, then at least we're not obfuscating what the real problem is, and we can have that conversation after that.
Great, thank you. There was another question here about how does Texas measure student growth? That's just growth in the state assessment. Is that right, Tim?
Yeah, it is. And we use prior tests to sort of create, it's complex, and by no means am I the right person to describe this technically, but conceptually, based off of prior distributions, we can get a feel for, well, if a student was to basically hold their place, what would their expected score be on the test in question? And basically, did they hold their place? Did they exceed it, or did they fall below it? And there's quite a sizable confidence interval there, so that if they fall below it, sort of nominally, but not really. They get rewarded for that. So it is based off the state assessment. It is based off of sort of an expected progress measure, and then the extent to which students that attend a particular campus or district meet, exceed, or fall below that progress measure.
Great, thank you. So being conscious of time, I wanted to share a few final thoughts, and we're looking forward towards the webinars that are coming up, and we know that there are so many ways in which we can tackle a challenge, and Tim spoke to some of them. By the way, I encourage you to follow up with him. There are even additional strategies that Tim did not have the time to speak about, including one teacher compensation strategies that I'm hearing about in Texas that I think is fascinating for equity, and thinking about the question that we just had about higher ed. There's so many things to do and so many ways to approach the development of strategies to close equity gaps. But what are the right strategies for a particular district? That's the question we want to answer. And here in the GTL Center, we've really developed this process of helping state answer that question by first analyzing data and doing a robust root cause analysis with the right stakeholders, and then thinking about implementation and sustainability of the strategies. But one issue that keeps coming up is this thing that we call the needs paradox. That we identify the need, we find the schools, we think about the strategies, but then those schools that are in most need of the strategies, those that we've designed the Grow Your Own or the Mentoring and Induction or the Teacher Leadership Program for, those schools are the least likely to be the ones that implement them in a rigorous way, if at all. And that's because of all of those characteristics of those schools. Maybe inadequate preparation of their teachers, lack of resources, poorer working conditions. You know those schools and you know those characteristics, those schools that serve predominantly low-income population that are identified for comprehensive and targeted support schools. So what we're going to issue in the next couple of days is a new resource that really analyzes these special characteristics, these special circumstances of those high-need schools, and helps you identify ways to address them when you design programs. How are you going to make your Grow Your Own program most accommodating for schools with poor working conditions, or how can you build a mentoring program in a school that doesn't have a lot of good mentors? A solution to these kind of problems that could help us finally make those schools the beneficiaries that they should be of our work. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up. And then, of course, please register to the webinars that are coming up in the next few weeks. We're going to focus on taking a deep dive on strategies, of equity strategies. The first, on August 14, is going to focus on Grow Your Own and our work with Wisconsin. The second, on August 23rd, is going to be about tools to strengthen the educator pipeline and to visualize and address teacher shortages. We're also going to showcase the diversity tool we have there. And then on August 27, we'll focus on our mentoring and induction work, particularly the work with Hawaii. So there's going to be a registration link at the chat now. Please register and attend those webinars. I think those are great example of great work that many states have done. And then just before you leave us today, and I'm also going to ask Jenny or Whitney to paste this link in the chat box. Please click the link and take 2 minutes to complete a feedback for the webinar, especially that we have 3 additional ones coming up. We would really take the opportunity to read your comments and see what we can improve for the next webinar. So thank you in advance for participating. Here's our contact information. If you have additional questions about equity and about equity strategies, and as I said in the beginning, questions about the Center on Graduate Teachers and Leaders and the transition that is coming up, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to be in touch with you. One last thank you to Tim Regal from TEA for joining us today and sharing of Texas work. It was fascinating to hear. And again, thank you all for joining. This work on equity means so much to us, and we're really happy that it means that much to you as well, and that you took the time to join today. So again, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.